Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elizabeth George, Director of Member Engagement and Chapter Development with the American Guild of Organists. And I'm pleased to welcome you to today's series of leadership talks, Banking Issues for Chapters. So before we get started and I introduce our presenter, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes. First and foremost, this is being recorded. So there will be a link to the recording along with a wonderful handout that Eric has designed that will be up on the website probably by Monday, and I will make sure that I send the link out to everyone who is on this webinar. The second thing is, if you do have questions, and by the way, we appreciate all the questions that were pre-submitted, and Eric has tried to address all of those within his presentation, but if you do have additional questions, please use the Q&A icon, which it's at the bottom of the screen versus using the chat box. The Q&A is just easier for me to read and easier for all of us to answer your questions. So before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about our presenter. Eric Burke is a fellow of the American Guild of Organists and has served as the executive assistant of the AGO national headquarters since January of 2012, following 17 years at the Flatbush Tompkins Congregational Church in Brooklyn, serving as an organist and choir director. He has served as president of the Associated Music Teachers League, as registrar of the New York City chapter, and as director of the 2015 Brooklyn Pipe Organ Encounter, and is currently treasurer for the Brooklyn chapter of the AGO. As a freelance organist, he serves as guest accompanist and a substitute in the New York City area churches. And he's much requested. I think I'm allowed to say that. He's in demand. One of his responsibilities at the AGO headquarters is to assist chapters in IRS filing procedures, hence the topic of today's webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Eric Burke.
Thank you, Elizabeth. First, I have to say that I'm not a lawyer, nor an accountant or certified financial planner or advisor, and nothing that I say in this webinar should be construed as legal or financial advice. So just be sure to remember that whenever you hear something that you need to check out with your own lawyer or your own accountant. The purpose of this webinar is to share information we have learned to assist AGO chapters with banking issues. You're going to hear some fire alarm announcements because they can never seem to get it right here at AGO headquarters. Second, I'm sharing with you today some issues and possible solutions for challenges our chapter leaders experience when dealing with banks. The content of this presentation comes from our staff experiences at AGO headquarters and my experiences not only as a chapter treasurer, but in other roles on boards of other nonprofit organizations. So now I need to address that we had some questions come in before I finished planning all of this. And I want to list what we're going to try to cover in addition to what I've got on the slides you see in front of you. We had questions about changing bank accounts, tracking chapter finances, chapter audits, checks with double signatures, best practices for chapters, debit and credit cards, online versus paper check transfers between financial accounts by the chapter holds, and record retention. So as we get started, the biggest issue that we have is that our chapters have needs and banks have requirements. So chapters need a secure place for their funds. They need to be able to track the income and expense activity that goes through their accounts. And they need easy access to their money. So if you've ever been part of a small organization that really isn't chartered like AGO chapters are, you can identify with the needs of having a bank. You don't want to have to keep all the cash in someone's cookie jar and not be able to know what's going on for all the members of your book club or your garden club or whatever. And so we have needs, and banks can and try to help those needs. But they're governed by anti-money laundering laws and know your customer laws. And since 2015, it's become a little more difficult to open and change signers on accounts. And we discovered this at headquarters very quickly. And the reason for that is that the Patriot Act was strengthened because anti-money laundering laws are meant to keep people from hiding money in nonprofit organizations as well as any other place. And the Know Your Customer laws mean that they want to know exactly who someone is and what the organization is before they give you an account. Now, to be fair, if you think about it, there's a couple of reasons banks would want to be careful about us. Our chapters are not usually incorporated on their own. They have their incorporation through our national organization, which is chartered in the state of New York. And so for most of our chapters, that means it's an out-of-state institution compared to that local branch. In addition, banks don't really make a whole lot of money off of us. There's only a few ways they can really make income: loans, the interest they get for that, their own investments, and then other business services that they sell. So we usually want, as a nonprofit organization, to have a free checking account. We want low fees if there's any fees at all. Now, we don't want to pay for anything because we don't have that much money to begin with, and we exist for what they call eleemosynary purposes, or public good. And as a professional education association, we have a lot more to think about than to have to deal with banks. So on our next slide, I think we need to start with the fact that you've got to know who you are as an organization, and you've got to know what your chapter status is. So before you walk in the front doors of a bank, there's a few things we have to get settled in our own minds, because we're going to get the 21 questions from the bank officer we're dealing with, or a junior employee who really doesn't know anything about your organization at all, or even a chapter organization. First, let's start with our incorporation status. We give you a packet when you request it that explains who you are, that can be presented to banks or any other institution who needs to know proof of your nonprofit and tax-exempt status. And the first issue that comes up in this packet beyond the cover letter is a letter from legal counsel of the New York State Department of Education. So this first bullet point makes it clear, and it's in our cover letter, that we were incorporated December 17th, 1896. So once they see that, the very next thing they want to do is go check it out. Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. So they want to verify your corporation status, and they're going to go to the state of New York, Department of State, and they want to see whether the Secretary of State has registered the American Guild of Organists, and they're going to discover that we're not there. Well, the reason we're not there is because we were chartered by the Department of Education, and the Department of Education does not post its own corporations in the state of New York. So the first three things after the cover letter in our packet for our chapters are letters from legal counsel verifying our existence and attesting to our corporation status as an organization. And we get this renewed every so often. The last time I think we did it was 2019. And then the second thing here, the IRS verified the tax-exempt status of the organization in 1955 pursuant to the 1954 tax code, but we were tax-exempt before that. And but this is the latest thing that we have, and we include that in the packet. So those two things are important to know before you walk in. And then the next thing is to know who you are as a chapter of the national organization. So the first part of that is that chapters are subordinate units. We got a group exemption from the IRS, which means that starting in 1909, or maybe even before that, we could form chapters throughout the United States, and now we've done so on several other continents. And all of our chapters in the United States are tax exempt through our group exemption, unless they got auto-revoked and then had to reapply on their own. So these subordinate units don't usually have any sort of incorporation status of their own. They're unincorporated local associations. So as a matter of fact, I was just on hold today for 10 minutes with my chapter's bank because we have to change signers. And I didn't get anywhere, but I was ready with all of my details. And I noticed on the account page information for the account that it lists us as an unincorporated association. So they are taking note of who their customers are, and they're recording that and what their status is on all documentation for their accounts of organizations. We're required in each chapter to have our own employer identification number. So your EIN number is granted you by the IRS, and they do that on a letter that you need to have a copy of because they will ask for it sometime in your chapter's future or past. This will or will have happened. And it won't be enough to say, look, I have this letter from the AGO and it says my EIN number is, because that's not proof. That's just our attesting to the fact. The IRS can provide this on request. It usually takes half hour or an hour on hold to get through to somebody, and then they send you a letter in the mail, and that needs to be kept on file with all chapter records, and you can present it when they ask for it. So now we're going to think about what the responsibilities of chapters are, because in addition to knowing who you are, you have to be able to prove that you are compliant with the law. And banks have a way of finding out without proof from you, but your filings are public record with the IRS. So we're all responsible for filing our chapters 990N, or if you have income of $50,000 or more, the 990 or the 990EZ. And then we should also have yearly financial statements of income and expense and balance sheet at the end of the fiscal year, which should go to your members, certainly should go to your chapter board, and it should go to AGO headquarters so that AGO headquarters knows that you're keeping accurate financial records. And then there are required state filings in some states that you may be responsible for. There are state registrations that some states do for unincorporated associations. I know Ohio does this. We recently found out that Washington State does not. So we have several chapters there who had to file incorporation papers in Washington State. There are charities bureaus in 40 states, and if you solicit funds from the general public, you're required to report to those charities bureaus. And then there's the possibility of having sales tax exemption. And I know 2 states where that doesn't exist for nonprofits. We found out Georgia and California, but there's other states too that don't provide this. And they all have different methods of providing proof or requiring reports of how you've used that. But that's not in every state the same. So any one of those pieces of documentation could be requested by your bank. And I should also mention that in each state, there are different corporation law requirements. Some states don't really care where your incorporation status derives from. Others want to have it in the state. And sometimes the bank wants to have a record of incorporation in the state in which they're doing business. And that may have to do with the type of bank it is. There's basically 5 types of banks. There are national banks, there are state banks, there are savings and loans, there are thrifts, there are credit unions. And we've had a lot of chapters that have had difficulties with some of the larger, what we call the big 5 banks. And if you have a problem with that and they're just not helping you, sometimes it's best just to go to a community bank where their compliance requirements are not quite so draconian. But that doesn't mean that you can't get the advantages you want from the bank that's going to give you the best service. If you have all the things in line that give proof of who you are and you can prove that you're doing things legally, it's much better and it goes much smoother at those big 5. And then the registration and filing requirements differ by state. So you might have to register we might have to register as a national organization in your state if we've not already done so as what's called a foreign entity. And then you will be able to organize your chapter with some sort of registration in the state you're in. So if you've not checked on that, I recommend doing so and then letting us know what we can do to help you. So now we need to talk about showing up the bank prepared with your documentation. Banks are not going to tell you all the time exactly what you need, because this is sort of an information gathering game where they want to make sure that they don't give away what you are required to give them that you might be required to show them without having had time to make something up. if you get my drift. So we provide you this portfolio packet, which you should always take with you if you're doing anything major at a bank. If you're opening a new account, if you're changing signers, if you're trying to negotiate for a better rate on some CD or an investment product that the chapter has, I would always be prepared with this document. We can update it anytime you need. We've done it more than once in the same year, and we can make the point of contact either your treasurer or your dean, or if you have another signer on the account that needs to be named, we can do that too. First thing there is the certifying letter that establishes your chapter as a subordinate unit of the AGO. Some people may go to the IRS to determine whether you're a chapter or not, but the IRS themselves say that they don't determine who our chapters are. Organizations with group exemptions are the certifying institution for who their chapters are. So that cover letter is very important, and that is what certifies your chapter as an official chapter of the AGO. So that if they want proof that your chapter is really a chapter, you have to point them to that letter. And it's worded such that they should be able to understand that. The New York State Department of Education Legal Counsel certifications that I talked about earlier are coming next in the packet. Then there are all subsequent amendments to our original charter. And then we have the IRS determination letters, the group exemption letters, and the latest update of the bylaws of the AGO. It's important to remember that chapters really don't have bylaws other than the national bylaws of the AGO. There's an entire article of the bylaws that are devoted to chapters. And what chapters should have that you might also make sure you have in writing are chapter operating procedures. So in addition to that packet, I would recommend making sure you have a copy of that available, along with these other documents. I mentioned already your EIN certificate, the tax exempt packet. And then I would also make sure whenever your treasurer does a filing with the IRS, you keep a copy of that, because the IRS has begun to post all 990 submissions publicly on their website. However, sometimes it's difficult for those looking from the general public to know whether they're seeing your actual chapter or not. So if you have a confirmation of your filing, and especially if you have a 990 with all the data like a tax return, you should be able to provide a copy of the latest year for anybody who wants to see it. Your chapter operating procedures, and if you don't have them, we have a sample copy on the website that you can determine your own for using. And then the most recent required state filings you might have. And then always have a list of your current chapter officers certified by your chapter secretary. Sometimes this may need to be what's called a corporate resolution, where the secretary of the chapter simply makes a letter that says resolves that as of election closing on such and such a date, the following people were elected to start terms on, ending, and you just have all that information on paper that the secretary signs on your chapter letterhead. And some banks have asked for this in the past to be notarized. So I would just be prepared with that. And we're at the time of the year where a lot of banks are, a lot of chapters are needing to go to their bank to change their signature people. And so that's definitely something you'll want to make sure you have ready to go if you're in that situation. So when you show up to change your signers, make sure you have the certifying packet. Be sure you have the EIN certificate. Some banks didn't always collect that information, so they might not have it on file. And then also the certifying letter from your chapter secretary about your election of officers. If you're opening a new account, there may be documentation you weren't prepared for. But if you have all the things that I've mentioned so far in this webinar, you will be more than prepared, and you should be able to answer any questions that come up in your appointment with the bank. I would say you should expect to need an appointment with a banker, especially right now with the pandemic. Some banks have limited hours. Sometimes they have limited staff availability to meet in person. I know that in my wait time just this afternoon to try to get a hold of my bank to change a signer, they said that they had to put me on hold again to find out if anyone would be available. So I'm supposed to do this next Friday, and we may or may not be able to get in, but we're going to try. Banks won't usually volunteer their complete list of requirements. So like I said earlier, it's kind of a game of making sure that the criminals can be found out because they're not prepared. So just be prepared with as many items as I've mentioned today, and I think you'll have everything you need. Remember that the bank's priority is to know who you and your organization are and that you're legitimately organized for a legal purpose. And I think most of our documentation pretty well establishes that, but you should expect surprises. They might want to have a list of your activities. They might want to see your organization's most recent financial report, whether that's a monthly or an annual end of fiscal year report. And also, you should expect to have to explain whatever a banker might not understand about organizations that have a group exemption. They may never have dealt with an organization with chapters. Some of the common national organizations that have chapters are things like the Red Cross, 4-H, which actually happened to have been one of the few organizations which is chartered by the Congress. It's a nationally chartered organization. So you could compare AGO to those organizations in trying to explain what we are. But because AGO is not in every town, it's not as common. And so you might have to actually ask to speak to someone else if the banker you're talking with doesn't understand. So I have some caveats that you might want to consider when you're dealing with your bank. Here's some do's and don'ts. I'll start with the do's because they're positive. Do take care to be consistent with your chapter name. I know you've probably seen yourself that many chapters use different references to identify themselves with the public or with their members. It could be Anytown AGO, it could be Anytown Chapter AGO, it could be American Guild of Organists, Anytown. Which is it? You should decide as a chapter and be consistent. Because more and more, when you deal with banks in person, they tend to be very specific about this kind of information, almost used like an identification method, like you would do to punch into a website as a password or a username. So you want to make sure that your account title matches what you call your organization. But also remember, you want to protect the account title. So for security reasons, you might want to avoid naming the account with the name by which it's publicly known. So for example, my chapter has put on its account title the chapter number we use in the organization, which happens to be 208. So our account says something about 208 in the midst of its name. So you could make it Anytown Chapter C, which is our code for C in the AGO, 001 AGO, instead of just Anytown Chapter AGO. Now this is up to you, and it's up to the bank to help you with this. So you might have a different solution. I'm recommending that you make sure your account title at the bank is not something that could be easily guessed. If you have ever been the victim of identity theft, which I accidentally discovered I was last year, and you will understand why this is so important. Anybody can pretend to be you, and you would think it's impossible, but it happens all the time, and it's becoming more and more common. Do have multiple signers on an account. That doesn't mean that they have to sign both people on every check, but at least have two people so that if something happens to one person, the account doesn't become unavailable to the organization without some sort of a court order or a big deal to be getting back into the account for the chapter. Do use a debit card and keep it in a safe place. Sometimes chapters need to get a credit card as well, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now here's some don'ts. Don't waste time arguing with a bank employee that doesn't understand your documents. This will be, unfortunately, a common occurrence. We had a situation here at AGO headquarters where they knew they needed something else, but they didn't know what to ask for, so they just kept going after what they thought was the right thing to ask for, which didn't make any sense to us. So it took a few weeks to straighten out, but finally we got to a manager who could explain what it was they needed, and they understood finally what our situation was so that we could provide them the documentation they needed. So I asked to speak to the bank manager or the local branch's chief executive officer, which may be a term of art that you need to use to be clear about who you want. Sometimes they use that word branch manager very, very generously to describe several employees, and not all of them may understand what group exemptions are or organizations with chapters. Also, don't be intimidated if you feel you aren't being treated fairly. Try another bank. Community banks are often friendlier toward and more knowledgeable about small local nonprofit organizations. So remember that banks ultimately do want your business, but they also have to protect themselves. And so if you're not getting the kind of service you really need, there's nothing wrong with going to a different bank. So after you've got your account going and everything's hunky-dory with what you want to do as a chapter on your money, there's some things you need to do to stay on top of your account. Make sure it's reconciled monthly. More than one person should watch the account. The treasurer, the dean, maybe another person, if you have an auditor position in the chapter, should watch the account online to verify deposits, to verify the checks that have been paid out, and all the account activity that happens. Notify the bank if you suspect discrepancies. Be transparent with the chapter executive committee about and members about financial status of the chapter. And avoid fraud. Do not publish viewable addresses on the chapter website. Put your email addresses of chapter officers hyperlinked inside a name or in the word email, or better yet, create a capture form for email communications so that someone who doesn't know the chapter and wants to ask a question about donating or something else has to submit their email, which goes to you, and then you respond to that. That keeps you from exposing your chapter officers to bots that might create scam or phishing emails. Also, make sure that the ledger and account statements are reviewed by members of the executive committee on a regular basis. Now, I think we need to stop for some questions. So, Elizabeth, do you have any things that have come in that we want to deal with?
Well, there's one, Eric, that I thought was good that you might want to answer. How long do I need to keep the records I've inherited?
Yes, I like this question a lot because unfortunately, when I became treasurer, I didn't have enough records. And so my answer was, congratulations on inheriting records. Now, I'm reading from my prepared document that will be posted later. Not all treasurers experience this, believe it or not. The National Council of Nonprofits recommends that each organization develop a document retention policy. The policy of the AGO, including chapters, developed by our legal counsel in 2013, but not currently published on the website, is as follows. So you'll have all of this in front of you, but I'm just going to go through it quickly as a summary. There are some things you need to retain permanently. Retain all governance records, things like amendments, bylaws, etc. The organization bylaws and your chapter operating procedures. The tax records of the chapter. You always want to have every year as far back as you can go, so that if the IRS loses some filing and they accuse you of not filing later, you can say, well, look, we did this 10 years before. What happened with you? If you've done it every year, you have some historical record that you can attest to your faithfulness in complying with the law. Also, your financial records, any audited financial statements, attorney contingent liability letters, anything that is of a legal or financial nature that states the condition of the chapter. So those are all the things you need to retain permanently. Those should never be destroyed, and they should be kept under lock and key and passed from one set of officers to the next. Then you should retain for 10 years pension and benefit records, which really doesn't apply to chapters. And then government relations records, things like state and federal lobbying and political contribution reports and supporting records. We really don't do political lobbying in the AGO, but if there's anything that you've done as a chapter to things like member care, things which you might have raised funds for, your like your charities registrations and campaigns that you did where you had to report fundraising, those things should be kept for at least 10 years. Then retain for 3 years any employment or employee records. And granted, none of our chapters usually have employees. However, you do hire artists. And if you pay them $600 or more, you need to file a 1099. And so that kind of a record should be kept for at least 3 years. And I think you could keep them even longer. I know that sometimes people get audited who have self-employment income. So if you kept yours for 7 years, which is the IRS requirement for the distance in the past that the IRS can go back to for individuals, that would be a really good service to those to whom you've given 1099s if you could keep them for 7 years. And then also lease, insurance, and contract license records. So any kind of insurance you've bought as a chapter other than what we already have for you for the chapter liability insurance, those shall be kept for 3 years. Then you should retain for at least 1 year all other electronic records, documents, and files. Correspondence that the chapter has with, local venues that you rent, anything like that should be kept for at least a whole year. And you could elect to keep any of these things permanently, but these are just the minimums. So any exceptions to the above in terms of, keeping it less can be granted by either AGO National Council or the Executive Director, James Thomashour. And you can also develop more stringent policies to items not covered above by using the recommendations of the National Council of Nonprofits. And I'm providing the web address for that, where you can look it up on your own. So that's that.
We do have a couple more questions. Are chapter bank accounts and certificates of deposit subject to an audit by an outside accounting firm? And if so, how often?
So this is one of our questions that is in the document. And let's see if I can find. So there is no AGO rule about this, but here's my answer. If an outside accounting firm is engaged by the chapter to accomplish an audit, the statements of account status and the chapter's reconciliation records certainly are subject to the auditor's review. An independent audit by an accounting firm can be required as part of the chapter's operating procedures. But it's best to be sure that what's required isn't too onerous to act upon, or it will not happen. Now, this is a very important point that I want to just pause in my answer to say, I've experienced, or I've watched this happen from a distance. There's a church that I know of here in Manhattan, which had a requirement to be audited every 6 months, but it never happened. And the reason it never happened was because the treasurer, who turned out to be embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars, was never going to let anybody see the checkbook. And so eventually she went to jail, and it was a really horrible case, and it's a situation you never want to be in. So the rules are not going to save you from anything. It's really the practices you put in place that keep everything honest. And so if you're going to have an audit, you need to provide a procedure by which you're prepared for it, because you can't audit a chapter who doesn't have records to show the auditors. So it's best to be sure that you don't make it too difficult. The charge for professional audit can be very expensive. We spend well over $10,000 here at AGO headquarters for our audits, and they're very well done. But we have enough things to keep track of that it's financially worthwhile to pay for that, because we need to make sure that what we put out in our reports is accurate, correct, and that we are doing due diligence for caring for the funds that have been donated to the AGO. And that can be true for your chapter as well, but you've got to be able to do it affordably. So you might be able to find an accountant that does this work pro bono. If you can't, you may have to pay, and it will depend on your level of complexity with your funds, record keeping and reports to know whether it's going to be costly. So it's best to have an independent audit, and it's best to obtain that pro bono. And it's challenging because someone known well to individuals asking for those services, or the organization that needs it, may be well known to them. And so it might be friends or family, and you want to have that auditor be as independent as possible from the organization that's being audited. At the very least, it's best to have a periodic internal audit by 2 executive committee members that are not related to or living with the treasurer or other officers responsible for financial dealings of the chapter, or who do not have regular access to the accounts and record keeping of the chapter. So it's always good to have another person that's not looking at the bank account, look at it later with all the statements that are provided, so that an independent person that's not tied to it. Because when you're the treasurer, the bank considers you the account holder. You're the person they're going to go to. That doesn't mean the money belongs to you, but you're in their eyes, you are the holder of the account. You're the person they're going to go to if they think you've broken the law, and you're the person on behalf of your chapter who takes care of the money of the chapter. So it's important to remember that we don't require you to be audited. We recommend that you do so if you can afford it, and that you ask people who are not regularly dealing with the money to look at what's happening and examine the records, asked to see the backup, the receipts, the paper trail that represents every transaction that's been reported on your financial reports.
Eric, I have a couple of other questions that have come in. Any advice on using credit unions versus banks?
Credit unions are insured by a different governmental authority. I think it's called NCUA. It's not the same thing as FDIC. It will depend on the credit union as to whether you're eligible to use it. Sometimes credit unions are started by schools, churches. I know the Air Force has one. My wife's family had a credit union account with the local base where her father was stationed. And sometimes it's for a very specific part of the population. Sometimes there are credit unions specifically for nonprofit organizations, and I would recommend that you look at that and determine for yourself if there's any risk. You want to make sure that the deposits are insured. That's the first thing. Some credit unions may use a different type of insurance. They're less regulated. That's the one thing you want to be careful about. There is insurance through the federal government for credit unions, but I don't know that they're all required in every state to do the same thing. So you want to just double check, because I've been around churches in New York City that have credit unions, and there's really not a whole lot of documentation. Unless you're a member of the church, you don't really have access to know what they've done to protect themselves and you as a depositor, unless you're a member. So I don't have any personal familiarity with those types of credit unions, but you do have to investigate them more than you would have to investigate a bank before you want to put your money there.
Another question, what about interest-bearing accounts? Any special filings of interest?
Well, as a nonprofit organization, I'm not sure what the law is about interest from savings accounts or CDs, but I would think that is income that if it's from donations and you're just having it there, you may owe interest on it depending on the amount you've earned. So that's best. You should ask an accountant about that and find out your tax liability. But if you do have interest, it's possible that it could be considered what they call unrelated business income, depending on the amount.
Okay, we've got one more that has come in. Is there a chart that shows the amount of money sent back to the chapter for each membership category?
Yes, there is. Well,
yes.
Elizabeth, if you don't have it, I'll give it to you and you can send that to them, okay?
We will indeed.
I think we've actually published that. I have it right here on my wall. It's published in TAO, and there's this little chart like this, and it was last published when with the current rates, the page that I took out was April of 2018. So I think we normally publish this in the April issue, so you might want to look at that. It was on page 21 in April of 2018. So that's the first place I would look, is the April issue of this year. I'm not sure, it hasn't changed in 3 years, so it should be the same this year as it was in 2018.
Thank you. I know there are a couple of other questions that are also going to be in this handout, but there was one that I thought might be interesting for everyone to hear. Do you have any specific software that you recommend chapters use for financial tracking purposes? Or do we have an account that chapters could use so we wouldn't have to pay a monthly fee to use software? I think I know the answer to the second one, but.
I gave an answer to this. Oh, here we go.
You did.
Most small to medium-sized chapters don't require something as sophisticated as QuickBooks, Quicken, or other applications like that. If revenue and expenses are reportable on a cash rather than accrual basis, a simple spreadsheet can easily accomplish record keeping. Not every software application allows integration with your bank account, and if they do, that can easily be discontinued. I have a friend here in New York who did all of his things with Quicken because it connected to his bank account, and then they discontinued that. And it was really frustrating for him because he was dependent on that being able to reconcile everything. We don't have a purchased set of software for this. What we use here at headquarters would be much too detailed and complex for chapters to use. And also, every treasurer is going to want to use what they're most comfortable with, and it would not be right for us to expect everybody to use the same tool. So because of this, we don't have anything, but there are inexpensive one-time fee products that you can find on the internet. I found one called simpleplanning.net that you might want to look into. They're available and helpful for small organizations like AGO chapters. It's best to keep it simple, whatever you do. I would not ask someone to learn to use QuickBooks if they've never used it before, even if they have a hand ledger. My grandfather was a public accountant, and I remember one of my birthdays, I think it was 9th or 10th birthday, he gave me an SE ledger. And I didn't know what to do with that. And my mother said, well, you could write down your allowance and what you spent all your money on. So that was the beginning of my education into what accounting was till I got to high school and had a class. But just because the software exists doesn't mean you need to use it. My chapter has probably 40 checks a year that we write. I don't need to use QuickBooks for that. A simple spreadsheet keeps it. But just make sure that your ledger is not the checkbook.
And I know there's another one, and it's on the same page, and I don't know if you want to go into this in detail because we will be giving it as a handout, but what's the best way to change banking institutions? Can everything be simply updated in OnCard once the transition is complete?
Okay, I'm going to change my share to my OnCard login. This question could actually be referring to two things. Is this the changing of a bank account from one institution to another, or have you already done that and you want to update what we have for the chapter at headquarters so that we send the ACH payment to the right place? So I'll answer both. To update the account information with AGO headquarters, the routing and account numbers can be entered in OnCard. So I'm showing right now my login to OnCard, and hopefully I'm still logged in. I'm going to click on Chapter Administration. Oh, and I had to log out. So when I get to Chapter Administration, which I'll go back and show you, the bottom button is Chapter Administration. You click there, and under my chapter, for chapter setup, my chapter information is there. And so you click on that button, and in the very top of that, this only is available to the treasurer. If you're coded as the treasurer in our system, you have access to this feature. And at the very top, it'll have ACH information with the bank name, routing number, and bank account number. And then you click Save Changes, and it's done. Now it's done there, but you need to contact us. So I'd recommend you call Molly Davey or send her an email message to let her know that you've done this. She's our membership assistant, and she will get in touch with our accounts payable person, and he will make sure that the bank account is set up to do the right routing to get the next payment to you. And I'd recommend you do that before the end of each month, before the end of the month in which you make a change, because we send ACH payments out, tends to be between the 10th and the 15th. And then if you have to change your banks, you'll want to do all those things we talked about earlier. Make sure you have your records. Make sure that you take all the people with you who are going to sign when you go in person to make the changes. You want everything taken care of at once. And if you arrive with all your paperwork and all of your people, the bank will take you more legitimately than if you don't do that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone, for participating. As I said, this is being recorded, and the link should probably be uploaded by Monday so that you'll be able to review it. And of course, you know where to reach me and where to reach Eric if you have any other questions. And we are going to have a follow-up webinar really talking about all the responsibilities of serving as a treasurer and how important it is for everybody to have a budget. I was amazed to learn that there were several chapters that really didn't. But we'll go into that another time. I want to say thank you for everyone. I want to thank Eric particularly for all the great information that he shared today. And Eric, it's nice to see you in the AGO office. So I want to wish everybody a happy and safe weekend. I used to always say on Fridays when I had to respond to emails, I'd say, have a great weekend, and then, or a relaxing weekend. And then it occurred to me that It really wasn't usually a relaxing weekend for someone that played the organ, but I will end now by simply saying thank you so much. We so appreciate you joining us today. Be safe and be well, and I hope to see you soon.